You're listening to international investment advisor Doug Goldstein on the Goldstein on Gelt Show, the financial show where we'll talk about how you can make the most of your money. With all the confusing financial chatter bombarding you each and every day, Goldstein on Gelt will give you the practical information you want and need about living a financially stable life. Here's your host, money maven Doug Goldstein.
Okay, we are back. I'm very happy to have on the Goldstein on Gelt show Dr. Vernon Smith, who is in the economics department at Chapman University, and he's the winner of the 2002 Nobel Prize in Economics, along with another former guest of the Goldstein on Gelt show, Professor Daniel Kahneman. Vernon, a real pleasure to have you on the show.
Well, Doug, thank you for inviting me.
So your area of economics is really quite fascinating. You do what's called experimental economics. Could you give us a short summary of what that's all about and why it differs from what other economists do?
Well, essentially, we use controlled experiments, either in the laboratory or the field, sometimes both, to test theories about behavior in market and social settings, to discover regularities in behavior. An important part of what I and colleagues do is to test bed new markets, try them out before we actually introduce them into the world. For example, various kinds of auctions or trading systems. And these are all rule-governed markets, and so that's what we test.
All right. So one of the things I know that you are involved in testing and looking at is housing bubbles, but this seems like something that can't be a controlled experiment because, quite frankly, for many people it seems rather explosive and painful and random. Are you able to actually develop controlled experiments when looking at housing?
Well, yes, in the laboratory. And that's where we get most of our understanding about sort of the elements that are going into to bubbles out there in the world. And what we do, and I want to contrast them with another kind of market where you never see any kind of bubbles. And that's where in the macroeconomy is a market for non-durables. These are things that you can't retrade. Most people don't probably realize it, but about 70% of private product cannot really be retraded.
So by that, just to clarify, you mean things like soap and products you would use around the house that you're saying are
hamburgers and haircuts, hotel rooms when you rent one. You buy an airplane seat, a right to go from A to B. Those things, you buy them to use them, actually consume them. And that's most of the products of the world, or of that kind. And those are incredibly stable. If you study them in the laboratory, people converge quickly to the equilibrium of of supply and demand that we can control in the laboratory. And out in the world, they tend to be very stable. They hold up even in pretty severe recessions. And thank goodness they do. So in other words, most of the instability in the economy comes from the stuff that's retradable. And and particularly long-lived goods. And a prominent example of that is houses. Mm-hmm. You know, people can. You see, if the price of hamburgers goes up, you don't change from being a buyer to a seller. You may buy less. Well, if the price of houses go up, you may decide maybe you own two. You decide to sell one. Or maybe you only own one. You decide to sell it and move into rental property. These are all things that you can do in that market.
So this applies to housing and stocks and long-term bonds and gold and commodities?
Yes, all securities markets, anything that's kind of storable is potentially of that form. But the main trouble comes with things like homes that people buy largely with other people's money, mainly mortgage credit. And if they collapse in price, it's against fixed long-term debt, and that right away impacts the equity of the household.
Presuming that there will be inflation, and not that past performance guarantees future returns, but historically there always has been inflation over periods that long, then you're going to be returning the deflated dollars. And what could be a better deal? You borrow $100,000, but you really only have to return future dollars, which are worth much less. So shouldn't that make this a constantly growing field?
Yes, and that does have a big effect on housing markets, but sometimes they can turn south in a big way. They did in 1929 and they did in 2007 in the United States, and they turned down. There was a deep decline. Also, this is what the origin of troubles in Japan in the early 1990s. A huge real estate boom turned into a collapse, and their economy suffered for probably 20 years as a result of that. And you do have these turnaround periods that are extremely painful, and explain the great depth you see of the Depression and the Great Recession, whereas most recessions are not that painful because it's just a little blip in housing. It isn't anything like this big collapse.
Right, and of course that's exacerbated if you owe money on the house. We're talking with Professor Vernon Smith, the 2002 Nobel Prize winner in economics. His area is experimental economics. Let's focus a little more on the real estate concept, but I'd like to drill into how do you do experiments on the real estate market to really understand the bubbles?
Well, the experiments that we started with, and this is back in the mid-'80s, early to mid-'80s, and of course we'd had a lot of experience with supply and demand markets, and they just worked astonishingly well. Well, we decided to look at markets where people could retrade, and maybe we could get some bubbles going. And we started out, and we had people were just trading an asset that had a yield, and we called it a dividend yield. So the concept was like securities, but of course, a home yields a rental yield to you. That is, it's an alternative to renting. So conceptually, it could be thought of as quite similar. And we gave people complete information on the dividend, and there's going to be a draw at the end of each period. And so the fundamental value was well defined. And we thought that would be an environment where there would be no bubble, because it was very clear. We were giving them all this information, and we were astonished. We got bubbles. And we thought we were creating an environment where we wouldn't get bubbles, and the idea was then to see if we can create them. Well,
Sorry, was this all academic? In other words, people literally sitting in a room, or were people dealing with their own real money, and you were just kind of guiding them?
Well, we pay them real money. That is, we give them cash endowments and share endowments in the lab, and they're going to trade they sit at a computer screen, okay, and it's a bid-ask, continuous trading market. In that sense, it's very much like a securities market, okay, and the value is well defined each period. It shrinks over time because you're using up draws. Okay, each time at the end of the period you draw a yield, a dividend, then it's one less that you're going to have in the future because the game only lasts, say, 15 periods. So it declines in fundamental value, and we remind people each period, hey, there's only 10 periods left, and the fundamental value, the dividend on average is 24 cents, so the fundamental value is 10 times 240 is $2.40. They pay no attention to that. Absolutely no attempt. We just get these big bubbles and then crashes near the end. Bring them back a second time, and the bubble it's still there, but it's not as high a volume. And the third time, they finally begin to get it.
Sorry, so you're saying that the players in your experiment actually grow up. They become more mature in terms of their ability to invest as opposed to just being traders in this market.
Yes, and for example, if you endow one group with more cash, one group of people who are being experienced. So we replicate. We run, say, we might run 4 experiments with high cash to share value, the same number of experiments with different subjects with low cash to share value ratio. And we get bigger bubbles if there's more money. Okay, more money, bigger bubbles.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's the analogy there is in housing markets. If credit is easy and there's a large inflow of mortgage credit, you tend to get a bigger bubble. And you had that huge inflow of mortgage credit. You see from 1997 to 2006 in the U.S. housing market, and then it flattened and it started down, and just, it really collapsed.
So we're nearing the end of our time, so I just want to ask you the question on that. A lot of people blame the legislation that was forcing the banks to give low-quality loans. Is that what led to this or encouraged that to happen?
Well, there were all things like that were going on, but and you had a lot of public housing programs trying to encourage, making it easier for low-income people to get into houses. That was going on, but a lot of that was not particularly new. That is, Fannie and Freddie had been subsidizing housing for decades in the United States. But it is true that once that bubble mentality started to take hold, and it was pretty well along by 2001, then all kinds of people were trying to, find ways to make people of modest means do better, get more wealth by getting them into a home.
Right, and I guess they believed this time was different, right? That's what they always say.
Well, yeah, but there was, I tell you what, there were plenty of problems both in the private and the public sector. For example, in the private sector, we had upfront fees for originating a mortgage. Well, if you get your money up front, you really, and then are selling the mortgage out the back door, you just don't, the due diligence starts to go out the window, you see. And you need to have incentive means of giving loan originators the same incentive that a lender would have. Mm-hmm. We propose spreading the fee in our book, Rethinking Housing Bubbles. We propose spreading whatever the fee is over the life of the loan in proportion to principal repayment. Well, if you want to make a 10-year interest-only loan, it means you get no principal payments for 10 years, and you get no fee for 10 years.
Got it. So
you're free to do that. But in other words, you try to give people more reasonable incentives here to behave themselves.
I hear. That sounds like a fascinating proposal. Vernon, we are just about out of time, but tell us in the last minute, how can people follow you and learn more about the book and learn more about the research that you're doing now?
Well, if the Economic Science Institute site at Chapman University is the place to go, and they can go in there and click on various options and learn a lot about what they do, and they'll also find out about the outreach workshops we do.
Okay, as well as the book, right? Rethinking Housing.
Yes, and I tell you what, we're working on water markets in California, and we'll probably have something here going for people to access sometime in the next few months.
All right, well, we will keep an eye on that here at Goldstein on Gelt, and as that comes up, we'll invite you back on to share with our listeners what you're learning there. Professor Vernon
Doug
Smith, I really appreciate your taking the time, and I wish you the best of luck with your research.
Thank you, Doug.
You've been listening to the Goldstein on Gelt Show with money maven Doug Goldstein. Doug's weekly radio show is heard around the world, but if you miss it, you can download the podcast at www.goldsteinongelt.com. The Goldstein on Gelt Show gives you up-to-date financial ideas so you can get on the path to financial freedom. If you'd like your questions answered on the air or off, send Doug an email to doug@profile-financial.com. It's your money for your future, so join Doug every week to build your wealth on the Goldstein on Gelt Show.